Hey Games for Impact, I'm Bob de Schutter. I'm a Belgian professor that likes to make games that are mindful of older players, and this is the artist statement for my game Brukel. So the marketing summary for Brukel will tell you that it's a first-person exploration game about my 92-year-old grandmother's childhood memories as told in her own voice. And that's pretty much what Brukel is about, but what it doesn't tell you is that my grandmother, well, she's a total badass. And she was born in the Brukel farmhouse in 1925 when life was a lot simpler, but also a lot tougher. You see, by the time that she was 14, she ended up having to manage the household for the family, which included 7 of her siblings. Now, when you play the game, you're gonna learn all about that, but that's really just the beginning, because well, World War II happened. And that Brukel farmhouse, well, it was right on the front line. Now, I don't want to spoil anything, but these stories are really hard to imagine if you've never had to worry about going without shelter, without food, without water, without air. Which is one of the reasons why I wanted to create this experience, because the vast majority of games that deal with war do this from the perspective of the heroic soldier that is trying to save the world from the evil that is the dehumanized enemy. And while the soldiers really play an important part in these stories, it is really through the interaction between them and the locals, while everybody's suffering, that you truly see who is a good person here and who's not. So my first goal with Brukel was to use the perspective of the innocent bystander to make a game that was more nuanced, but also a game that would be capable of making people less judgmental of people that have to flee their homes and immigrate to another country. And of course, there are other games that have used that perspective before. You might have heard of This War of Mine, which came out around the time when the development of Brukel started. In fact, I originally was exploring a similar 2D side-scrolling simulation style of game design for Brukel as well, until I started to interview my grandmother and I heard her recorded voice for the very first time.
De plitsvlek is zo op mijn hart gelopen. Oh.
The way she tells these stories as she envisions everything again is just so poignant that I had to do a different style of game to make sure that her voice would be carrying you through the emotional ride that she lived through in her own life. So it became an exploration game with some horror elements in which she talks you through everything as you experience it all in first person. Now, when I saw how well that worked in the playtesting, even until the point where my playtesters would forgive me for all my technical limitations, I decided I had to give it a name. So I called it Gaminissing, or reminiscing through interactive, playful experiences, if you will. And over time, that idea took center stage, because it does something that very few games do. If we think about the representation of older adults in games, it's typically a matter of tropes. There's the wise granny that explains or unlocks parts of the game, the granny in distress that really needs your help, the action granny that's over the top for comedic purposes, and the gruesome granny that represents age-related body horror. However, in Brukel, my grandmother is none of the above, as she is represented on her own terms. Sometimes vulnerable, oftentimes quite strong. And because of that, both me and my grandmother are quite happy with the result. And as a game designer, I'm also quite fond of how the game can be seen as a comment on historical tourism. You see, in the beginning of the game, you start in modern times as you traverse the house controlling the narrative by taking pictures with your smartphone, but then the war stories take over and you're forced to do whatever is asked of you or you're just not gonna make it very far. And quite frankly, that is how my grandmother's life was back then, even before the war. You see, many of the things that would have been luxuries to my grandmother back then, we now take for granted. And because of that, well, we run the risk of losing them. So I hope that Brukel inspires you to gaminize the stories of your loved ones, because we have to make absolutely sure that we will never forget our past. So thanks for listening and enjoy Games for Impact.